partway through drilling the holes for the door hinges and the actual doors themselves, and the way I ended up doing it was I removed one of the bolts from each of the hinges, and I sort of wedged the door in place. So I sat it in place and clamped it in place in the exact right position, and then I was able to drill through from the back side through the existing screw hole. And I think I mentioned before, when I drilled these hinges, I drilled both sides at once. So I had them closed. So instead of drilling 6 holes, I had them closed and I drilled 3. So I know that when the hinges are closed, the holes align with each other. So I was able to have the hinge closed. I actually keep them separated with a little scrap of aluminium, which keeps the 2 sides of the hinge parallel. Otherwise they close a bit too much. They close in like that, whereas you want them parallel. So those just held in place as spacers, and then I was able to drill through one hole at the top, and then I put a temporary pin through, which is just a 6mm bolt. Put that temporary one through to hold the top, and then I did the same at the bottom. And now I've got those single holes. I'm able to bolt the door in place, and now I'm doing my trick with another drill block, sort of drilling guide, to be able to put the holes through and make sure they're square. And this block needs multiple holes and this little step to sit over the hinge. So I can move this around and I pick the appropriate hole. I poke the drill through far enough so it started in the hinge, and then I clamp this in place, and then that ensures that the holes I'm drilling through are completely perpendicular to the face of the hinge. That's the plan, at least. Let's see how it goes. So this just gives you an idea of how this is used to make sure the holes go through straight. I haven't been making the holes oversized, but I'm guessing if you want adjustment in the door, I can make the holes a little bit bigger, and that lets everything move in relation to each other. But I try to start with everything as accurate as possible. The other thing I've realized is I can trim down my door pillars here, because when the door fits in the right place, there's a bit of a step here, but that's because I've actually allowed a little bit extra on the inside, so the timber isn't sits out past the chassis rail by about 1/8 of an inch. So I could actually make this a little bit narrower if I really want to. I don't think it's really going to matter. I don't want to get too close to the edge of these holes. I have trimmed the hinges, and I've made the notches in the door part because it was pretty easy to clamp that to the edge of the bench. And I used my little razor saw to cut the verticals, and then I mainly used the Shinto file or the Shinto rasp to cut out the middle. I did use a hammer and chisel and got rid of most of the middle piece, and then flattened it off with this, and then finished it off with the old flat bastard, which that never fails to be amusing ever since intermediate school. I think it was when we first did metalwork. So the other thing I have done is prepared some blocks. I am going to drill and tap these so that the door hinges go into these captive blocks rather than individual nuts and bolts. I think that'll be much easier to do. I have marked up these ones and marked the hinges, but I think drilling and tapping them will be a job for tomorrow probably. But I do want to get this door hung just to see if it works, so I'm just going to bolt it back together temporarily for now. That seems to be a door. It does have to move forward about 1/8 of an inch once I notch the hinges, but that actually works pretty well. It even opens and closes. The hinges aren't perfectly aligned at the moment. It's all just done up finger tight. So there's a bit of, it's not too bad. There's no play in it. Yeah, that seems to have come out really well. And when it's in the right place, I may have to adjust the shape. So, of course, I was only able to do it fairly approximately when it wasn't fitted to the car, but now I can actually sand this back a little bit to get it to fit perfectly. Well, better anyway, maybe not perfect. So these will open. Basically it'll go till it hits the front tyre. So there are check straps normally to limit the amount of opening, but that's not too bad. And again, this took me longer than I thought it was going to. I figured I'd have both sides done by this time, but no, obviously not. And I think what I'll end up doing is actually getting the door onto the hinges is quite fiddly, trying to get it all bolted in place. That's one of the ways I think using those tapped blocks will be better. But yeah, that's the first side done. I'm really pleased with that. I now have both doors mostly fitted. Again, I have to notch the body part so that the doors sit flush, but no, they seem to work really well. I did start making little plates to use instead of nuts. I actually cut them all up and somewhere drilled and tapped some of them, but the problem is you have to be really accurate with your drilling and tapping so that all the holes line up. And at the moment I have everything is so tight on the hinges, they're actually in the correct place as they are, as I drilled them. And in order to use the blocks, I would have to kind of open out all of the holes a little bit, and I'm reluctant to do that at the moment while the doors are actually fitting nicely. So I've just got to leave it nuts and bolts for now. It may actually be that the easiest way to remove the doors is once it's all built and the hinges are actually bolted in place, it might be easier just to remove the pins and take the doors off that way. So I'll have to see how easy these pins are to knock out. But it really does show the shape now. One thing I do need to do is on the originals, there's actually little metal tabs that come out here. I think I'll just make a little plate that screws on here with a couple of little tabs, and they're there to stop the door going in too far. I have just noticed, I think this piece of timber, this door, is actually twisted. I think that's what's happened there. So I may end up having to glue bits on and reshape it, because this edge, this side's a bit better, should be flush. So it might be fixable. It doesn't really matter. I'm getting very finicky now, I think, with some of these details. But yeah, this might need some tweaking. And I guess what I should do now is see if I can actually get in and out of the car, which means I'll go and change my boots for my driving shoes so I can actually fit. So I'll do that and see if the door actually works as a door. Turns out, yes, I can get in and out. although I'm pretty sure this bit of the frame is going to get a little bit scuffed up. I think there's actually a cover that goes over this. I'll have to check that. But no, I can get in and out, and I can fit in the footwell, and I have actually tweaked the position of the throttle pedal just to get it away from the brake, so I can cleanly push the brake and get to the pedals if I need to. It's going to need some tweaking once it's actually on the road, I guess. But oh, with the door in place, yeah, you get to see why it's very tight. You get to see why the door handle is actually on these cars up here. There is not a lot of room. These are not big cars at all. So here's the passenger door. But yeah, that door will actually open all the way around without a strap. So I've just noticed I've dinged the top corner off it already. I'll have to repair that. Actually, it won't matter because it gets covered in metal, but the fit's pretty good. And I think I could narrow this bottom rail a little bit. The chassis rail is actually in, so it's actually a bit wide here. So that could be narrowed a little bit, just to make this tidier. But the doors have trim on them anyway. So on the test, yep, I can reach out and touch the ground. Ooh. So the Riley's in bits again. Got the front half of the body off, which is good because it means it'll make it much easier for me to finish off these floor sections and firewall, or the lower half of the firewall. And I have the body up on the bench because I have been cutting out the notches for the hinges in the body pillars. So again, I just use my razor saw, cut a slot, and then I use my Shinto file to knock it out. I use the hammer and chisel just to get it started, because I'm worried of this happening, which is where little chips come out of it, because I tried to go too deep with the chisel. So it's actually easier just to use the file, and I use a couple of offcuts of the hinges just to check my depth. And you can see here I've got the aluminium in the hinges just to keep the two flaps parallel, and that fits pretty well. One thing you'll note is I sunk it all the way in, and this is actually on purpose so that when I wrap the skin around the doors, I can put shims in here, so I can get this front. I can set the front gap basically. So all I need to do is put a spacer underneath the hinge here, either on the door or on the body. Probably on the door. Don't think it really matters. So I can adjust this gap. So at the moment it's very tight. Once you've got skin wrapped around each of these, it would be too tight. So the idea is I can put, say, a 2 or 3 mil shim underneath the hinges to set that gap exactly where I want it. It's kind of designed that these are meant to be in alignment. They're pretty close. So that's the body. This line is actually the edge of the chassis rail, so I could make these a little bit narrower, just clean them up a bit, which I think I will do. And the other thing I might do while the body's off is trim these in a little bit, probably just with a jigsaw, just to remove some of the weight. It doesn't need to be there, it doesn't need to be that thick. That piece is quite curved on the top, so I need to just consider where I'm going to do that, just to narrow that out. Not sure how I'm going to be able to cut that actually. Probably a jigsaw in this direction, I can get most of it, and this direction here. It'll just save a little bit of weight. So the firewall, this is pretty much flush, so now I need to reduce this by the correct width to make everything line up. And just notice this, things like this can be tidied up, maybe make that a bit thinner. Everything's a little bit fat at the moment, so I can adjust it. And it actually occurred to me after I took the instrument panel off that you can leave the instrument panel attached, because it bolts to this, and this bracket that it bolts to here, you can unbolt that from the frame. So this one I may actually leave unbolted, because then I can take the front of the body off without removing the instrument panel, which would be quite handy. But that gives a better idea of the floor. And I think what I'm going to do, I'll bring these up to probably maybe all the way up to where the front of the inside front of the sort of lip or the box on the front of the firewall goes. It'll be somewhere there. If I've got a piece coming up like that and another piece coming down, I can just bolt those two together, and that's where you separate them off. I think that'll work quite well. I really need to get all the spiders off it. But yeah, the frame's coming along. I will need to sand it again. I was always being fairly careful not to get too much gunk, oil and grease and stuff on the frame, but it's all going to be stained black anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I think the other thing I will do is paint these. So I have the bits of the body sitting in the evaporust, just to get the surface rust off them. But today it is raining, so it's not a very good day for doing painting, unfortunately. So, and the only other thing I have to do is, this is the side where I accidentally drilled an extra hole. So I need to fill that in and make sure I fill in the right one, which is this one. So I'll do that, and I'll also put a little bit of glue in here where this little chip came out. No, it's not really a big deal, but I can easily fix that. So that's where we're at with the doors. It's one of those weekends where everything's ended up in a mess again, so I'm going to be doing a big cleanup again. That's all a mess from notching the door hinges. I have the frame up. I had it outside. The weather's meant to be really bad this weekend, and it was yesterday. But as usual, the weather here is never quite as bad as it is everywhere else. So there were floods and slips and lots of drama in other parts of the country, but here it's actually quite a nice day today. But I had it outside doing some sanding. I did thin these down. I have effectively notched the top here just to make this a little bit thinner, less chunky looking. Doesn't really matter, you can't see any of that except from inside the car, which you can't easily see anyway. I've given it a quick sand. Very early on when I first made the frame, I was very careful to keep the timber clean, but then of course I realized I'm going to stain it black anyway, so I used to try to avoid touching it and try to avoid getting marks on it. It doesn't matter, it's going to be black, so you're not going to notice. So I've been playing with the Firewall. So this is a little bit tricky. You have to get the shape of this correct, the lip, but on the Firewall this isn't a 90-degree angle. It's actually a varying angle depending on the curvature of the body at that point. So there's more curve down here, more angle on it, than there is at the top, say, because the bonnet is almost flat. It's not quite. So as just kind of trial and error, I use my my drawing compass here to sort of mark out. I figured out what the thickness needed to be. It's about 5mm, and I made up some little shim things. So the way this will work is the firewall is going to be wrapped in aluminium, so you've got a layer of that. You've got a layer off the bonnet tape. You'll have the bonnet, which will be aluminium as well. That'll sit on like that. And then the skin is going to be steel, and that'll wrap around the frame. And you want these to line up, basically. And it's never going to be perfect, but that pretty much gave me a gauge. Focus. So I can sort of run that around and just check the gaps. And I think that's going to be good enough. Maybe down here I need a little bit more taken off. It's a bit hard to do with one hand. Oh, I've just noticed. Oh, I thought that might be a crack. No, it's just the part of the grain. So by doing that, I can figure out how much to take off. And I'd previously made this so it was effectively flush with the body, so that gave me the correct angle. And then you need to reduce that size, like take that diameter down. So as I mentioned, I figured out what it should be, 5mm, and I marked a line on each side, and then using the linisher, because it's on an angle, you just can't hold it flat. If it was 90 degrees, it could be flat, but it's on an angle, and it's on a varying angle. So what I did was, if the angle was supposed to be like that, when I sanded it down to the first line, I used a steeper angle, so that it was sanding to the line, but not to the correct angle, if that makes sense. I'll probably have to draw it. So somewhere here, that was my calculations for the heights. So if you look at an edge on, and the piece of timber has to be like that, and you need to shorten it to there, I drew a line here and a line here, and then when I sanded it on the linisher at an angle like that. So eventually you get it to there, and then you flip it over and you do the same there, and you end up with a little peak, and then you can just sort of flatten the peak down till you hit those edges, if that makes sense. And that's much easier to do, and I found that worked really well. So I've got the angles there now. The next thing will be just making sure that's right, and then I think I'm probably going to start treating and staining the timber. And of course, before doing anything, it's best to check it on the car. So I've just set it back in place. It's on the rubber blocks, so everything's sitting in the correct place. It's not bolted down though. And I went around and checked it with my little gauge, and that seems to be about right. I should check the angles as well. So I need a straight edge, so I can run it from there over to here and make sure that seems to line up correctly as well. And you can sort of see there the cutouts I took out of the big chunky bits on the top. I weighed the timber I took out. That saved me 600 grams. So the ash is actually pretty light. One of the reasons they used it, I guess. I had hoped to get to the floor, do some more work on that, but everything else took so long I ran out of time again. And I have painted the brackets. Those ramps actually make quite a good hanging rack. I just clamped it to my shelves, and that box is pretty heavy, so it holds the other end down. These aren't very heavy, of course. So those are all the brackets cleaned up and painted, and I have stained the firewall just one side because the other side is going to be covered in aluminium. So should only need to do the back of it. So the next thing to do will be, I think I can look at treating the body now. Pretty sure that's all the holes that need to be drilled in it. Any others, of course, I can still drill them after I've treated and painted the timber. So maybe that'll be the next thing. Once the firewall is dry, I'll get the front of the frame up there and start treating that. I think I might need to get more of the stain I'm using. I think I've used about half a tin so far, so there's probably about another tin in it. The ash takes quite a bit. I don't know if it's because the preservative seals it a little bit, so it's harder for it to soak in, or if it's just because it's a hard wood, so it doesn't take the stain very well. I'm not really sure. I will give it a light sand before I put the preservative on it, just to make sure there's no oil or grease from greasy hands on the timber. That'll stop it soaking in the preservative. But yeah, I think that wasn't too bad for a weekend's worth of work.